She was unable to finish her last melody because the world was crying. Her voice shook, and tears fell. When the world weeps, even the strongest voices tremble. She sang her final song through tears, a melody the heavens themselves couldn't bear to hear. Her voice cracked not from weakness, but from the weight of every sorrow she ever carried. And in that trembling note, the world found its reflection, in loving memory of all those who create beauty while falling apart, who play their final melodies with shaking hands and brave hearts, who teach us that broken things can still sing, and that sometimes the most perfect performance is the one where we finally stop trying to be perfect and simply allow ourselves to be true. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comments section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Let's begin. The concert hall stood like a cathedral of dreams against the Tokyo skyline, its glass facade reflecting the amber glow of the setting sun. Inside, 3,000 seats waited in hushed anticipation, each one filled with a soul who had traveled from the furthest corners of the earth to witness what they believed would be magic. They had no idea they were about to witness a miracle wrapped in tragedy, a moment so profound it would echo through their lives like a bell that never stops ringing. Backstage, in a dressing room that smelled of roses and expensive perfume, Yuki Matsumoto sat before a mirror bordered by lights that seemed too bright, too harsh, too revealing. Her reflection stared back at her with eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone who had just turned 28. Those eyes, once compared by critics to liquid starlight, now held shadows that makeup could no longer hide. Her hands trembled as she lifted them, watching the way her fingers shook like autumn leaves in a wind only she could feel. These were the hands that had caressed piano keys since she was 4 years old, hands that had won her the Chopin competition at 16, hands that had written symphonies that made grown men weep and children dream of impossibilities. Now they betrayed her, shaking with a tremor that no amount of willpower could still. 15 minutes, Miss Matsumoto, called a voice through the door, gentle but insistent, the voice of a stage manager who had witnessed 1,000 performances but sensed this one would be different. Yuki closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her like a tide that could no longer be held back. She remembered her grandmother's wrinkled hands guiding her tiny fingers across ivory keys, teaching her that music wasn't just sound, it was the language of the soul made audible. She remembered her mother's proud tears at her first recital, how they had caught the stage lights like diamonds. She remembered Kenji. Oh God. She remembered Kenji and the way he would close his eyes when she played, as if her music painted colors only he could see. The trembling in her hands intensified, and she pressed them flat against the cold surface of the vanity, willing them to be still, knowing they wouldn't obey. 3 months ago, the doctors had given her the diagnosis in a sterile white room that smelled of antiseptic and crushed dreams. Degenerative neurological condition, they said, using words that sounded clinical and cold. Progressive loss of motor control, they explained, as if they were discussing a broken machine rather than the dismantling of a life's purpose. 6 months, perhaps a year, they estimated, before her hands would no longer answer the commands of her desperate heart. She had canceled the tour. Of course she had. How could she perform when her body was becoming a prison, when the very instruments of her art, her blessed, cursed hands, were turning into traitors? Her manager had understood. Her record label had issued a statement about health concerns and needed rest. And the music world had sent its sympathies like flowers to a funeral that hadn't happened yet. But then she had received the letter. Tea had arrived on rice paper, folded with a care that spoke of trembling fingers much older than her own. The handwriting was shaky but determined, each character formed with the precision of someone for whom writing had become an act of will rather than habit. The letter was from Mrs. Tanaka, an elderly woman from a small fishing village Yuki had never heard of, a place where the ocean sang louder than any concert hall. Mrs. Tanaka wrote about her granddaughter, Hannah, who was 12 years old and had been born deaf. She wrote about how Hannah had learned to feel music through vibrations, placing her hands on speakers and her feet on wooden floors, experiencing symphonies as earthquakes of emotion that traveled through her bones. She wrote about how Yuki's recording of Debussy's Clair de Lune had been the first piece of music that had made Hannah cry, tears streaming down her face as she felt the notes pulse through her small body. And then Mrs. Tanaka wrote about the cancer, about how the doctors had given Hannah 3 months, about how the little girl had only one wish before she left this world, to feel Yuki Matsumoto play live, just once, to experience that miracle of vibration and emotion in person, to know that beauty existed even in a silent world. The letter had ended with a simple plea. She doesn't need to hear you. She just needs to feel you. Please, before it's too late. Before both your hands and her heart stop beating. Yuki had read that letter 17 times, each reading carving deeper into her soul. And in that moment, she had made a decision that everyone around her called foolish, reckless, even cruel. She would perform one last concert. Not for the critics or the crowds or the legacy she might leave behind. She would perform for Hannah and for every broken soul who needed to know that beauty could exist alongside sorrow, that music could bloom even in the darkest winters of the human experience. 10 minutes, Miss Matsumoto. She stood, her black gown rustling like whispered secrets. The dress had been chosen carefully, elegant but simple, something her grandmother would have approved of. Around her neck hung a pendant, a small silver piano that Kenji had given her the night he proposed, 3 years ago, in a garden where cherry blossoms fell like pink snow. She touched it now, feeling its cool metal against her skin, remembering his smile, remembering how he had believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. Kenji was gone now, taken by a drunk driver on a rain-slicked highway 2 years ago, leaving Yuki with memories that cut like glass and a diamond ring she could never bear to remove. Sometimes she wondered if her illness was grief made physical, if her body was simply refusing to continue in a world where he no longer existed. A knock at the door, softer this time. Yuki? It's me. She opened the door to find her best friend and former piano teacher, Professor Sato, his weathered face creased with concern. He had been there for everything. Her first lesson, her first competition, her first heartbreak, Kenji's funeral, the day she received her diagnosis. He knew her hands better than she did, had studied their movement and grace for 24 years. You don't have to do this, he said quietly, not for the first time. Yes, I do, she replied, not for the first time. Your hands will fail whether I'm on stage or hiding in my apartment. At least this way, they failed doing what they were meant to do. He studied her face, and she saw the moment he understood, truly understood. This wasn't about pride or stubbornness or a refusal to accept reality. This was about choosing how her story would end, about writing the final chapter in her own hand, even if that hand shook like a leaf in a storm. Then play like the world is ending, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Because for you it is. And that gives you a freedom most performers never find. Play like you have nothing to lose, because you don't. He embraced her then, a brief, fierce hug that spoke of all the years between them, all the triumphs and disasters they had witnessed together. When he pulled away, his eyes were bright with tears he was too proud to shed. 5 minutes, Miss Matsumoto. The walk from the dressing room to the stage felt like a journey across continents. Each step echoed in the empty corridor, and Yuki found herself counting them, a meditation technique her grandmother had taught her when anxiety threatened to overwhelm. 1 step, breathe. 2 steps, remember why you're here. 3 steps, feel the ground beneath your feet. 4 steps, you are alive, you are alive, you are alive. She could hear the murmur of the crowd beyond the heavy curtain, 3,000 voices creating a symphony of anticipation. They didn't know what they were about to witness. They had come expecting perfection, expecting the technical brilliance that had made her famous, expecting a performance they could discuss over wine and post about on social media. They had no idea they were about to witness a woman fighting her own body for the right to create beauty one last time. Yuki paused at the edge of the stage, her hand resting on the cool metal of a support beam. She thought about Hannah, sitting somewhere in that audience, feeling the vibrations of 3,000 heartbeats, waiting to feel the vibrations of music that would transcend sound. She thought about Mrs. Tanaka's letter, still folded in her purse, carried like a talisman against despair. The stage manager touched her shoulder gently. It's time. The curtain rose like a breath being released, and Yuki walked into the light. The applause was immediate and thunderous, a wall of sound that hit her like a physical force. She stood there, letting it wash over her, seeing the faces blur into a sea of expectation and hope. The concert hall was magnificent, all soaring ceilings and perfect acoustics, designed to carry every note into every corner, to ensure that not a single whisper of music would be lost. The grand piano waited at center stage, its black lacquer surface reflecting the stage lights like a still pool of water. It was a Steinway Model D, the same model she had played for her debut at Carnegie Hall, the same model Kenji had saved for months to rent for their apartment, so she could practice at home. She had specified this exact model for tonight, because if these were to be her last notes, they would be played on an instrument that remembered who she had been before the world started crumbling. She walked to the piano, her steps measured and deliberate. She did not bow or acknowledge the applause. She simply sat, adjusted the bench with hands that shook more noticeably now, and looked out at the audience. And there, in the front row, she saw them. Hannah was small for 12, her frame delicate, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf that couldn't quite hide the absence of hair beneath. But her eyes were enormous and dark and filled with a fierce, desperate hunger for life that made Yuki's breath catch in her throat. Mrs. Tanaka sat beside her, one weathered hand clasping her granddaughter's. And when their eyes met Yuki's, the gratitude in them was so profound it almost broke her. Next to them sat a man who couldn't have been more than 30, his face drawn and pale, his body thin beneath an expensive suit. Another person for whom time was running out. Beside him, a woman whose eyes were red from crying, clutching the hand of a small boy who stared at the piano with wonder. Around the concert hall, Yuki suddenly saw them all, the sick, the grieving, the broken, the desperate. They had come not just to hear music, but to remember that beauty existed, that there were still things worth feeling in a world that often felt too cruel to bear. This was not the audience she had expected. This was not the collection of critics and classical music aficionados who usually filled concert halls. Her manager had told her that when news of her one final performance had leaked, despite their attempts at secrecy, the ticket requests had been overwhelming. But instead of the usual classical music elite, the requests had come from hospitals, from support groups, from families writing desperate letters about loved ones who needed to witness beauty before they left this world. Her manager had chosen carefully, filling the hall not with those who could analyze and critique, but with those who needed to feel and remember and hope, even in the darkness. Yuki placed her trembling hands on the keys and closed her eyes. The silence in the concert hall was absolute, the kind of silence that only comes when 3,000 people collectively hold their breath. In that moment, suspended between expectation and execution, Yuki felt the weight of every choice that had led her to this piano bench, to this concert hall, to this moment where her failing body would attempt what her spirit still demanded. She had planned her program carefully, each piece chosen not for its technical complexity, but for its emotional resonance. She would begin with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece her grandmother had loved above all others. Then Bach's Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier for its mathematical perfection and emotional purity. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata would follow because Kenji had proposed while she played it. And she would close with her own composition, a piece she had titled Melody for a Silent World, written specifically for Hannah, for this moment, for this goodbye. But as her fingers touched the keys, as she felt the cool ivory beneath her trembling fingertips, she realized something that sent a shock of terror through her system. Her hands were shaking worse than ever. The tremor that had been slight backstage had intensified under the pressure and emotion of the moment. She could see her fingers vibrating against the keys, could feel the lack of control that no amount of willpower could overcome. This was worse than any practice session, worse than her darkest fears. This was her body staging a full rebellion, refusing to cooperate at the exact moment she needed it most. Panic clawed at her throat. She couldn't do this. She couldn't perform like this. She would humiliate herself, destroy the memory of everything she had been. disappoint every person in this audience who had come hoping for beauty and would instead witness a grotesque parody of her former skill. She should stand up. She should apologize. She should walk off this stage and preserve what little dignity remained. But then she felt it. A vibration traveling through the stage floor, so subtle most people wouldn't notice it. Someone in the audience had stomped their foot, gently but deliberately. Then another vibration, and another. Hannah and the others who had come to feel rather than hear were signaling their presence, reminding her that they were here, that they were waiting, that they needed this even if it was imperfect. Yuki opened her eyes and looked directly at Hannah. The girl's hands were pressed flat against the wooden armrests of her wheelchair, already positioned to feel every vibration that would come. Her eyes met Yuki's across the distance, and in them, Yuki saw no expectation of perfection. She saw only hope and hunger and the desperate need of a dying child to feel beauty one last time. And Yuki understood, with a clarity that cut through her fear like light through darkness, that this performance was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be true. She took a deep breath, feeling it fill her lungs, feeling her heart beating its wild, terrified rhythm, feeling the tremor in her hands that would not and could not be stilled. And instead of fighting it, instead of trying to force her body into submission, she decided to do something she had never done in 24 years of performing. She decided to surrender to the imperfection. Her fingers descended onto the keys, and the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne bloomed into the air like flowers opening to the sun. They were not perfect notes. They wavered where they should have been steady, hesitated where they should have flowed. But they were achingly, heartbreakingly human. The tremor in her hands translated into a tremolo effect that Chopin himself had never written, but which somehow made the nocturne sound like it was being played by someone remembering a beautiful dream while crying. Yuki let the imperfection become part of the music. Where her fingers shook, she let them shake, and the resulting sound was like ripples on water, like wind through leaves, like the natural trembling of all beautiful, fragile things. Where control eluded her, she found new forms of expression, letting the music become a conversation between what she intended and what her body could produce, between the ideal and the real, between the artist she had been and the human she was becoming to eye in the audience. Hannah's eyes widened as the vibrations traveled through her wheelchair and into her body. She had felt recordings before, but this was different. This was alive, imperfect, raw. Each note carried with it not just sound, but struggle, not just melody, but meaning. She could feel the tremor in Yuki's hands translated into trembling harmonics that made the music sound like it was weeping and laughing simultaneously. Mrs. Tanaka's hand tightened on her granddaughter's as tears began streaming down her weathered face. She had heard Yuki Matsumoto perform before, years ago, when the pianist was at the height of her technical powers. That performance had been flawless, brilliant, absolutely perfect. It had been beautiful the way a diamond is beautiful, hard, clear, untouchable. This performance was beautiful the way a broken heart is beautiful. Vulnerable, raw, impossibly brave. As Yuki's fingers moved through the nocturne, she felt time beginning to dissolve. The pain in her hands was intense now, a burning ache that traveled up her forearms and into her shoulders. But she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the music, on the story she was telling through these imperfect notes. She thought of her grandmother, who had died in her sleep at 87, her final words a whispered, "The music never ends, Yuki. It just changes form." The nocturne reached its climax, and Yuki's hands trembled so violently she thought they might simply refuse to continue. But they didn't. They played on, shaking and uncertain, but playing, always playing, because that was what they had been trained to do for 24 years, and even dying, they remembered their purpose. The final notes of the nocturne faded into silence, and Yuki paused, her hands hovering above the keys. The silence that followed was different from the silence before she began. This silence was filled with emotion, with 3,000 people collectively processing what they had just witnessed. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the concert hall, someone began to clap. Not the polite applause of a classical music audience, but the fierce, gratitude-filled clapping of someone who had just witnessed something transcendent. Others joined in, and within seconds, the entire audience was applauding, not for technical perfection, but for courage, for vulnerability, for the raw beauty of a human being refusing to surrender to the cruelty of fate. But Yuki barely heard them. She was already preparing for the next piece, for Bach's prelude, for the mathematical perfection that would now be filtered through her imperfection, through her humanity, through her slowly failing body that was teaching her, even in its betrayal, that art was not about control but about truth. Her hands descended once more onto the keys, and the crystalline notes of Bach began to fill the air, each one trembling with life, with death, with everything in between. Part 2. The Mathematics of Sorrow. The Bach prelude was supposed to be about precision, about the perfect mathematical relationships between notes that made the piece feel inevitable, like a proof in geometry. But as Yuki's trembling fingers moved across the keys, the precision gave way to something more profound. The mathematics of sorrow, where each imperfect note calculated the exact distance between what we hope for and what we're given. In the audience, Professor Sato pressed his hand to his chest, feeling his heart break and mend and break again with each measure. He had taught Yuki this piece when she was 8 years old, her small fingers stretching to reach the intervals, her face scrunched in concentration as she tried to achieve the mechanical perfection that Bach seemed to demand. She had mastered it within a week, playing it with such precision that it sounded like a music box, beautiful but somehow lifeless. Now, 20 years later, she was playing it wrong. The tempo inconsistent, notes occasionally blurred together, the crystalline clarity muddied by her shaking hands. And it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Because now, Bach's meditation on perfection had become a meditation on imperfection, a recognition that we are all broken mathematics, all equations that don't quite balance, and in that brokenness lies our humanity. Yuki felt sweat beginning to form on her forehead as the pain in her hands intensified. It was like playing through flames, each note costing her something, each measure extracting a price her body was less and less willing to pay. But she continued, because in the front row, Hannah had closed her eyes, her face tilted upward, her entire being focused on feeling the vibrations that pulsed through the concert hall like a heartbeat. The girl was smiling. Despite the cancer eating away at her small body, despite the deafness that had been her companion since birth, despite everything cruel and unfair about her brief, precious life, she was smiling. Because she could feel beauty. Because in this moment, music was not just sound but physical presence, not just art but love made tangible, not just performance but gift. And seeing that smile, Yuki found a strength she didn't know she possessed. The pain didn't disappear, but it became background noise, something happening to her body while her spirit focused on the only thing that mattered, translating emotion into vibration, soul into sound, love into the language that transcended all barriers. The prelude built to its climax, the rising sequence that Bach had designed to feel like ascending a staircase toward heaven. Yuki's hands were barely cooperating now, but they climbed those musical stairs nonetheless, each note a step higher, each measure bringing her closer to that moment of transcendence that Bach had written into the very structure of the piece. And then, just as she reached the highest note, her right hand seized completely. Time seemed to stop. The note hung in the air, waiting for resolution that Yuki's frozen fingers couldn't provide. The pain that shot through her hand was so intense that black spots appeared at the edges of her vision. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, her hand simply refused to move, and the unresolved chord hovered in the air like a question that would never be answered. In the audience, people leaned forward, sensing something was wrong, but not yet understanding what. Professor Sato half rose from his seat, his face contorted with worry and the fierce desire to somehow help, to take this burden from her, to sacrifice his own hands if it meant she could continue. Hannah's eyes opened, and even though she couldn't hear the music stop, she felt it, the sudden absence of vibration, the pregnant pause where beauty had been. Her smile faltered. Yuki looked down at her traitorous right hand, seeing the fingers curled and useless, and felt despair threatening to overwhelm her. This was it. This was where her body finally won, where the disease claimed its victory, where she would have to stand and walk off stage, defeated by biology, humiliated by her own hubris in thinking she could will her way through this performance. But then she remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago when young Yuki had complained about a piece being too difficult for her small hands to play. Music doesn't require perfection, child. It requires presence. Sometimes the most beautiful melody is the one you have to create from the notes you can actually reach. In that moment of crisis, Yuki made a choice. If her right hand wouldn't cooperate, she would finish the prelude with her left hand alone. She had never done this before, had never even practiced such a thing, but desperation breeds creativity, and she began to improvise, her left hand leaping across the keys to cover both bass and melody, creating a stripped-down version of Bach's masterpiece that somehow, impossibly, captured its essence. The audience realized what was happening. 3,000 people watched in breathless amazement as Yuki Matsumoto, her right hand hanging useless at her side, recreated Bach's prelude with only her left hand, simplifying, adapting, reinventing on the fly, turning disability into a form of desperate artistry that it should have been impossible. It should have been a disaster. Instead, it was a kind of miracle. The simplified version forced the listener to fill in the missing notes with their imagination, to become participants in the music rather than mere recipients. It was Bach reduced to its essential skeleton, and in that reduction, the beauty of the underlying structure became even more apparent. Like a drawing where the artist's hand is forced to capture everything with just a few perfect lines, the one-handed prelude revealed the pure mathematics of Bach's genius in a way the full version never quite could. Tears streamed down Yuki's face as her left hand raced across the keys, but she was no longer crying from pain or frustration. She was crying because she had just discovered something profound. That limitation could be liberation, that losing the ability to play perfectly meant finding the freedom to play truthfully, that sometimes you have to lose everything before you can find what actually matters. The final chord of the prelude rang out, played only in the bass register by her tired left hand, and the silence that followed was cathedral deep and holy. This time, no one applauded. No one moved. The audience sat frozen, processing what they had just witnessed, not just a performance, but a transformation, not just music, but a lesson in how to face the unfaceable with grace and courage and an almost terrifying determination to find beauty even in destruction. That Hannah's face was wet with tears. She probably didn't realize she was crying. Mrs. Tanaka held her granddaughter close, and the two of them wept together, feeling through vibration what most people could barely process through sound. Yuki flexed her right hand, testing it, and found that some mobility had returned. The seizure had passed, leaving behind a throbbing ache but also renewed function. She would be able to continue, at least for now. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that it would happen again. The disease didn't retreat. It only regrouped before the next assault. She turned to face the audience directly, something she had never done in the middle of a performance before. Her face was streaked with tears and sweat, her carefully applied makeup ruined, her hair coming loose from its elegant arrangement. She looked human and broken and beautiful in her brokenness. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice rough and barely above a whisper, but in the perfect acoustics of the concert hall, everyone heard. "I wanted to give you perfection. I wanted to be the pianist I was before. But I can't. This is all I have now, these shaking hands, this failing body, this desperate need to make beauty before it's too late. I'm sorry it's not perfect. I'm sorry I'm not perfect." For a long moment, no one responded. Then Hannah, who couldn't hear the words but could read Yuki's face and body language, began signing frantically to her grandmother. Mrs. Tanaka translated in a voice choked with emotion, speaking loud enough for Yuki and those nearby to hear. She says you have nothing to apologize for. She says this is the most beautiful thing she has ever felt. She says perfect would have been pretty, but this is true. She says thank you for showing her that broken things can still make beauty, that broken people can still have worth. Yuki's breath caught in her chest. She looked at this dying child who understood, truly understood, what she was trying to do here. And in that moment, all the pain, all the fear, all the grief about losing her gift became somehow bearable, because it was being witnessed, validated, transformed into meaning by this small girl who knew what it meant to live with a body that didn't work the way it should. "This next piece is for you, Hannah," Yuki said, still speaking directly to the audience, abandoning all the formal conventions of a classical performance. And for everyone here who knows what it means to lose something precious, this is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and I'm going to play it the way my fiancée, Kenji, loved it, slowly, like a prayer, like someone trying to remember a beautiful dream before it fades completely. She turned back to the piano, placed both hands on the keys, her left hand steady, her right hand trembling but present, and began to play. The opening notes of the Moonlight Sonata filled the concert hall like darkness made audible, like the sound of starlight falling on water, like every beautiful sad thing you've ever felt but couldn't put into words. Beethoven had written this piece when he was going deaf, when he was losing the very sense that his life's work depended on. He understood what it meant to create beauty while losing the ability to fully experience it. Yuki poured everything into this piece. Her love for Kenji, her grief at his loss, her terror about her own approaching dissolution, her desperate hope that something of beauty could survive even when the maker of that beauty was gone. Her right hand shook through every note, but somehow the trembling added a vulnerability to the piece that matched its melancholic mood perfectly. She remembered the night Kenji proposed, how she had been playing this very piece in their small apartment. The windows open to let in the spring air, cherry blossoms drifting past like pink snow. She had been so focused on the music that she hadn't noticed him kneel beside the piano bench until she reached the end of the first movement. When she finally looked up and saw him there, a ring box open in his trembling hands, his eyes full of love and hope and a fear that she might say no, she had started to cry so hard she couldn't speak. So she had answered him with music instead, playing the second movement of the sonata, the brief, hopeful interlude that Beethoven had placed between the sorrow of the first movement and the storm of the third. It was her way of saying yes, of saying I love you, of saying I want to build a life with you filled with beauty and hope, even though we both know how fragile and temporary everything is. Kenji had understood. He had always understood her language of music, had learned to read her moods and thoughts through the pieces she played and the way she played them. When she was angry, she played Prokofiev. When she was melancholic, it was Debussy. When she was in love, it was always Beethoven, always this sonata, always the second movement that sang of hope in the midst of darkness. They had been married for only 14 months before the drunk driver's car crossed the median on that rain-slicked highway. 14 months of waking up next to him, of cooking breakfast together, of him falling asleep on the couch while she practiced late into the night, of building a life that felt like its own kind of music, imperfect, improvised, beautiful. The night of the accident, she had been performing in Osaka, playing this very sonata for an audience that had applauded politely but couldn't know that with each note, she was thinking of her husband, sending him love across the miles through the only language she had ever truly mastered. While she played, he was dying on that highway, calling her name according to the paramedics, and she was on stage, playing their song, unaware that the person who understood her music best would never hear her play again. Now, as her shaking hands moved through the first movement of the sonata, she played not just for Hannah but for Kenji, for the ghost of him that she carried in her heart, for the future they would never have, for the children they had talked about naming, for the house they had planned to buy, for the old age they would never reach together. The first movement ended, and without pause, she moved into the second, the brief, delicate movement that had been her yes to his proposal. It lasted barely 2 minutes, a small island of hope in the darkness, and as she played it now, her right hand trembling but somehow holding together, she could almost feel Kenji beside her, could almost hear his breathing, could almost believe that death wasn't final, that love could transcend the boundaries between the living and the dead, that music was a bridge that connected all souls across time and space. The third movement began. The famous storm, the tempest of notes that surges and crashes like waves against rocks. Yuki's hands were screaming with pain now, but she drove them forward, demanding that they give her these final moments of beauty before they failed completely. The notes tumbled over each other, fast and furious, and her trembling fingers struggled to keep up with the demands of the piece. But instead of trying to match Beethoven's intended tempo, she allowed her limitations to reshape the music. The storm became less fierce but more desperate, like someone running as fast as they can while knowing they'll never escape what's chasing them. The tempo shifts became erratic, mirroring the way grief hits you. Sometimes as a manageable sadness, sometimes as a wave that knocks you to your knees. In the audience, people were openly weeping now. They had come for various reasons, some to witness greatness, some to find hope, some simply because they needed to feel something in lives that had become numb with suffering. But all of them were being given something unexpected: permission to be imperfect, permission to fail, permission to be broken and beautiful simultaneously. The young man in the expensive suit, whose name was Takashi and who had been given 6 months to live by doctors who spoke in careful, clinical terms, felt something shift in his chest. He had been so angry at his cancer, at his body, at fate, at a universe that would allow a 30-year-old man to die before he had truly lived. But watching Yuki fight her own body for the right to create beauty, he felt his anger begin to transform into something else. Not acceptance exactly, but a kind of fierce determination to make whatever time he had left matter, to find his own version of this defiant beauty. Beside him, his mother clutched his hand and wept for the son she was losing, for the grandchildren she would never have, for all the futures that would never be. But she also wept with a strange kind of joy, because in this moment, watching a broken woman create transcendent art, she was reminded that her son's life, however brief, had been beautiful. That the love she felt for him was beautiful. That even grief, even loss, even death itself could be beautiful if you had the courage to face it honestly. The Moonlight Sonata rushed toward its conclusion, Yuki's hands barely holding together, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and pain and the sheer effort of will required to keep playing. The final cascading runs approached, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that her hands wouldn't make it through. The seizures were starting again, her fingers beginning to curl involuntarily. She had maybe 30 seconds before her hands would fail completely. She made a split-second decision, simplifying the ending, cutting out the ornamental runs, and focusing only on the essential chords, the bare bones of Beethoven's conclusion. It was butchery in a way, removing so much of what made the ending spectacular. But it was also truth, the acknowledgement that sometimes you have to choose between maintaining the illusion of perfection and admitting that you're human, that you're dying, that you're doing the best you can with what you have left. The final chord crashed down, both hands somehow coming together despite their trembling, and the sound filled the concert hall like thunder, like triumph, like the sound of a human soul refusing to go gentle into that good night. Silence. Then Hannah stood up. It took effort. Her body was so weak, her muscles wasted by the cancer and the treatments that had failed to stop it. Mrs. Tanaka tried to help her, but Hannah gently pushed her grandmother's hands away. This was something she needed to do herself. The entire audience watched as this small, dying, deaf child stood on legs that shook as badly as Yuki's hands, stood, and began to APPL. AUD. Her hands came together in silence that Yuki could see, but Hannah could not hear. Clapping with all the strength left in her fragile body, one by one, the entire audience rose. 3,000 people standing, applauding, many of them crying openly, all of them witnessing something they knew they would carry for the rest of their lives. This wasn't applause for technical mastery. This was applause for courage, for vulnerability, for the sacred act of creating beauty while falling apart. Yuki stood, her legs weak, her hands hanging at her sides like foreign objects, and bowed deeply to the audience, to Hannah, to all the broken people who had come here, hoping to remember what it felt like to be whole. But she wasn't finished yet. She raised her hand, asking for silence, and the audience slowly settled back into their seats. Hannah sat down too, her grandmother supporting her, both of them watching Yuki with an intensity that seemed to fill the space between them with light. "I have one more piece," Yuki said, her voice amplified by the perfect acoustics though she barely had the strength to speak above a whisper. "I wrote it for this moment, for Hannah, for all of us who know what it means to live in bodies that betray us, in a world that breaks us. I call it Melody for a Silent World, and I need you to understand something before I play it." She paused, gathering her thoughts, her courage, her final reserves of strength. "This will be the last thing I ever play. My hands, they won't survive another piece. The doctors told me I shouldn't perform at all, that the stress could cause permanent damage, that I'm shortening what little time I have left with functional hands. And they're right. After this, I will never play piano again. After this, these hands that have been my voice, my purpose, my entire identity for 24 years, they will be just hands. Broken hands. Useless hands. Her voice cracked, but she continued. But I realized something tonight, watching all of you, feeling Hannah's presence in that front row. I realized that we spend our whole lives trying to preserve ourselves, trying to save our strength, trying to make things last as long as possible. We hold back. We save our best for later. We wait for the perfect moment that never comes. And then we die, with so much beauty still locked inside us, so much love unexpressed, so many songs unsung. Tears flowed freely down her face now, but her voice grew stronger. I don't want to die with my music still inside me. I don't want to save these hands for a tomorrow that will never come. I want to give you everything, right now, while I still can. I want to play this final melody like the world is ending, because for me, it is. And that's okay. That's okay because you're here to receive it, to witness it, to carry it forward when I can't anymore. She looked directly at Hannah. You taught me that, Hannah. You, who have lived 12 years in a silent world and still found a way to feel music. You, who have months to live and still smile. You, who showed me that broken doesn't mean finished, that limitation doesn't mean limitation of spirit, that we can be dying and still be fully, completely, beautifully alive. Mrs. Tanaka was translating in sign language, her hands moving through the air like birds, and Hannah was nodding, crying, understanding in a way that transcended language or hearing or any physical sense. Yuki turned back to the piano and sat down for the last time. Her hands hovered over the keys, and she took a moment to really look at them. These hands that had been her instruments of creation, her tools of expression, her bridge between the internal world of emotion and the external world of sound. They were shaking badly now, the tremor so pronounced that she could barely hold them steady. But they were still her hands. They had carried her this far. They would carry her through one more piece. This is for you, Hannah, she whispered. This is for Kenji. This is for everyone who has ever loved something they knew they would lose. This is for the beauty that exists not despite our brokenness, but because of it. She began to play. The melody was simple at first, almost childlike in its purity, single notes in the right hand, gentle chords in the left. It sounded like a lullaby, like something a mother might hum to a child who couldn't sleep, like the musical equivalent of a gentle hand on a fevered forehead. But as the piece developed, it began to change, to grow more complex. The melody started to stutter, to repeat itself with slight variations, like someone trying to remember a song they'd once known but had partially forgotten. The tremor in Yuki's hands wasn't a flaw now. It was the piece itself, built around the reality of her condition, incorporating the shake and shiver into the composition. It was music about imperfection, made from imperfection, embracing imperfection as its central truth. The harmonies were strange, unsettling, beautiful in unexpected ways. Yuki used dissonances that should have been harsh, but somehow felt right, like the musical equivalent of a broken heart that still manages to love. The rhythm was inconsistent, speeding up and slowing down not with artistic intention, but with the reality of hands that could no longer maintain steady tempo. And it was the most honest music anyone in that concert hall had ever heard. Hannah closed her eyes and pressed her hands flat against the arms of her wheelchair, feeling every vibration. The piece wasn't just sound. It was a conversation with death, an argument with fate, a love letter to life written by someone who knew she was running out of time to express everything she felt. The melody climbed higher, Yuki's right hand reaching into the upper registers of the piano, each note a small act of defiance against the disease that was destroying her nervous system. Her hand was seizing again. She could feel it, but she pushed through, accepting the pain as part of the music, letting it inform every note. Then something extraordinary happened as the pain intensified. As her control slipped further away, Yuki stopped trying to play the piece she had written and started improvising, allowing whatever came out to come out, surrendering completely to the moment. The melody became a conversation between intention and accident, between what she wanted to play and what her failing hands could actually produce. And in that surrender, in that total acceptance of her limitation and loss, She found a freedom she had never experienced in 24 years of technically perfect performances. She was no longer Yuki Matsumoto the prodigy, the competition winner, the acclaimed virtuoso. She was just Yuki, a woman who loved music, who was dying in her own way just like everyone else, who had chosen to spend her final moments of ability creating something beautiful for strangers who had become, in this shared experience of witnessing, something like family. The improvisation became wild, passionate, uncontrolled. Her hands moved across the keys in patterns that made no technical sense, but perfect emotional sense. It was grief and joy and rage and acceptance all mixed together, all true simultaneously, all valid expressions of what it meant to be human in a world that gives us beauty and consciousness and love, and then takes it all away. Professor Sato was sobbing openly now, his distinguished face twisted with emotion. He had spent 50 years teaching piano, trying to help students achieve technical perfection, and here was his greatest student teaching him something he had never learned, that the point was never perfection. The point was always this: to feel deeply, to express honestly, to connect truly, to live fully even in the shadow of death. The young man named Takashi had his eyes closed, his hand still held by his mother, and he was mouthing words. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Because Yuki was showing him how to do it, how to face the ending with grace and courage and a determination to squeeze every last drop of beauty out of whatever time remained. Around the concert hall, 3,000 people sat in absolute stillness, barely breathing, afraid that any sound might disturb this sacred moment. They were witnessing someone give everything, hold nothing back, sacrifice the possibility of future performances for the certainty of this one perfect, imperfect moment. Yuki's hands were failing completely now. Her right hand could barely move, the fingers curling into a claw despite her desperate attempts to keep them extended. Her left hand was shaking so violently that she could no longer control which notes she hit. But still she played, or tried to play, or something beyond playing. She made music with whatever she had left, even as that grew less and less. The melody became sparse, reduced to single notes in the bass register that Yuki could reach with her left hand. The silences between notes grew longer. The piece was ending not with a grand finale, but with a gradual dissolution, like a voice fading, like a light dimming, like a person dying. But it was beautiful. God, it was so beautiful, because it was true. The final notes came slowly, painfully, each one costing Yuki more than the last. Her vision was blurring with tears and exhaustion. Her entire body was shaking now, not just her hands. She had perhaps 5 notes left in her before her hands would fail completely. 5 notes to say goodbye to music, to her identity, to everything she had been. She played the first note, a low, resonant tone that vibrated through the concert hall like a heartbeat. The second note, higher, questioning, like someone asking, is this really the end? The third note, returning to the original melody, the lullaby theme, like coming home after a long journey. The fourth note, wavering, uncertain, her hand barely able to press the key. And then, for the final note, Yuki did something no one expected. She asked for help. "Hana," she called out, her voice breaking. "Come help me finish this." Mrs. Tanaka signed frantically, and Hana's eyes went wide with disbelief and joy and terror all mixed together. The grandmother helped the girl to her feet, and together they made their way onto the stage. Hana leaning heavily on her grandmother, her steps slow and painful but determined. The audience watched in breathless silence as this small, dying, deaf child approached the piano where Yuki sat with her useless hands. Mrs. Tanaka helped Hana into position beside Yuki on the piano bench. "Put your hands on mine," Yuki whispered, guiding Hana's small hands to rest on top of her own trembling ones. "Feel the music through me. We'll play the last note together." Hana's hands were so light, so fragile, like bird bones, hollow and delicate. But when she placed them on Yuki's, something electric passed between them. An understanding, a connection, a recognition that they were both fighting the same battle against bodies that were breaking, against time that was running out, against a world that could be unspeakably cruel and unbearably beautiful in the same breath. Together, their 4 hands descended onto the final key. The note rang out, pure and clear and strong, amplified by their combined touch, resonating through the concert hall with a power that transcended the physical limitations of either player. It was the sound of two people refusing to surrender, of beauty created in the midst of dying, of love expressed through trembling hands and broken bodies. The note sustained, held by the piano's pedal, and Yuki and Hannah sat together as it slowly faded, growing quieter and quieter until it was more memory than sound, more feeling than hearing, more spirit than vibration, and then silence. Complete, absolute, sacred silence. Yuki looked at Hannah, and Hannah looked back at her, and in that moment, they understood each other perfectly. They had created something together that neither could have created alone. They had taken their mutual brokenness and forged it into beauty. They had proved that weakness could be strength, that limitation could be liberation, that the end could be a kind of beginning. Tears streamed down both their faces as they smiled at each other. Two people who had never met before tonight, who came from different worlds and different generations, who were united only by their love of music and their knowledge that time was running out, that their bodies were failing, that death was patient and inevitable and already reaching out its hand. But in this moment, death could wait. In this moment, they were alive. Mrs. Tanaka helped Hannah back to her seat, and Yuki remained at the piano, her hands finally at rest, no longer trembling because they no longer had the strength even for that. She looked out at the audience, at 3,000 faces wet with tears, at 3,000 hearts that had been broken and healed and broken again by what they had witnessed. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing. Thank you for reminding me that music isn't about perfection, it's about connection. It's about being brave enough to share your broken heart with strangers and trusting that they'll understand. It's about making beauty not despite our suffering, but from it." She stood, her legs unsteady, her body exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. She bowed deeply, formally, the way her grandmother had taught her to bow after her very first recital when she was 4 years old, and the audience rose as one, applauding with a ferocity that shook the walls of the concert hall, applauding not just for a performance, but for a lesson in how to live, how to die, how to face the unbearable with grace and courage and an almost holy determination to create beauty even when the world is crying. Yuki walked off stage, each step an effort, and she knew, as she left that concert hall, that she would never return. Those hands that had carried her through 24 years of music would never play again. The disease would progress, the tremors would worsen, and eventually even simple tasks would become impossible. But she had given everything. She had held nothing back. She had played her final melody not with perfect hands, but with true hands, honest hands, hands that shook with effort and love and the desperate need to express beauty before it was too late. Backstage, Professor Sato caught her as her legs finally gave out, holding her as she wept against his shoulder, tears of exhaustion, of grief, of relief, of something that might have been joy. "You did it," he whispered. "You perfect, impossible, brave fool. You did it." "I couldn't finish it," she sobbed. "My hands failed. I needed Hannah to help me play the last note." "No," he said, pulling back to look at her, his own face wet with tears. "Don't you understand? That was the finish. That was always meant to be the finish. The whole piece was building to that moment. When you stopped trying to do it alone, when you accepted help, when you shared your music with someone who needed it as much as you needed to give it. That was the melody's conclusion. That was perfect." And Yuki realized he was right. The piece wasn't incomplete. It was finished exactly as it needed to be, with two broken people creating beauty together, with weakness transformed into strength through connection, with the recognition that we are all just trying to play our final melodies as beautifully as we can before our hands fail, before our voices shake, before the world starts crying, and we can no longer pretend that everything will be okay. 3 months later, Yuki received a letter that it was written in Mrs. Tanaka's shaky handwriting, and it arrived. On a Tuesday morning when the cherry blossoms were blooming and the air smelled of spring and new beginnings. "Dear Yuki-san," it read, "I am writing to tell you that our beautiful Hannah passed away peacefully last night, in her sleep, with a smile on her face. In her final weeks, when the pain became too much and the treatment stopped working, she would ask me to play the recording someone made of your concert. She would place her hands on the speaker and close her eyes, and for a few minutes, the pain would fade and she would be at peace. She told me, in those final days, that she wasn't afraid anymore, that she had felt beauty, that she had been part of something perfect, that she had played music with you, and that note you played together, that final, perfect note, would go on vibrating through the universe forever, even after both of you were gone. I don't know if that's true. I'm just an old woman who has lost the most precious thing in her life. But I choose to believe her. I choose to believe that the beauty you two created together that night transcends death, transcends silence, transcends all the cruelty and unfairness of a world that takes children before their time and gifts from artists before they're ready to let them go. Thank you, Yuki-san, for giving my granddaughter that gift. Thank you for showing her that broken things can still make beauty. Thank you for being brave enough to fail in front of 3,000 people, because in your failure, you gave all of us permission to be imperfect, to be human, to be beautifully, tragically, gloriously alive even as we're dying. Hannah's final words, signed to me just before she closed her eyes for the last time, were these: "Tell Yuki-san that I heard her music. I heard it with my whole body, with my whole heart, with my whole soul, and it was the most beautiful sound in the world." With deepest gratitude and love, Mrs. Tanaka. Yuki read the letter sitting in the apartment she had shared with Kenji, looking out the window at the cherry blossoms that bloomed and fell and bloomed again, indifferent to human suffering and human joy alike. Her hands lay useless in her lap, the tremor now so constant that she required help with even the simplest tasks. She could no longer button her own shirts, could no longer hold a pen steady enough to write, could no longer do any of the thousand small things that make up a life. But she had played her final melody. She had given everything. And somehow, impossibly, it had been enough. She thought of Hannah, hoping that wherever the girl was now, if there was anywhere to be after death, she could finally hear the music she had spent her life feeling through vibrations. She thought of Kenji, wondering if he and Hannah might somehow meet in whatever came after. Two souls who had loved music and understood its power to connect us across all barriers. And she thought about that final note, played by 4 hands on one piano, hers trembling with disease, Hannah's weakened by cancer, but together strong enough to create something beautiful, something true, something that would echo forward through time, carried in the hearts of 3,000 witnesses who had learned that broken things can sing the most beautiful songs. Outside, the cherry blossoms continued their ancient dance of blooming and falling, and somewhere in the city, Professor Sato was teaching a new student to play piano, passing on not just technique, but the lesson Yuki had taught him. That music is not about perfection, it's about truth. It's about being brave enough to play even when your hands are shaking, even when the world is crying, even when you know the melody won't be finished the way you planned. Because sometimes the most beautiful endings are the ones we create together, with the notes we can still reach and the strength we can still muster and the love we can still share, right up until the very last moment when our hands finally fail and someone we've inspired, someone we've touched, someone who carries our music forward, plays the final note for us. Yuki closed her eyes and let the spring sun warm her face, and in the silence of her apartment, she swore she could still hear it. That last note, vibrating through the universe, held by 4 trembling hands, perfect in its imperfection, beautiful in its brokenness, eternal in its truth. The melody was finished. And it was enough that it was more than enough, that it was everything, that the loving memory of all those who create beauty while falling apart, who play their final melodies with shaking hands and brave hearts, who teach us that broken things can still sing, and that sometimes the most perfect performance is the one where we finally stop trying to be perfect and simply allow ourselves to be true. Please like, and subscribe, please.